The U.S. Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board held a day-long meeting in Washington, D.C.'s Ronald Reagan Building on June 22, 2005, on the critical subject of the hazards of combustible dust at industrial facilities. The meeting was convened by the CSB as part of a comprehensive study of the causes of dust explosions, following tragedies in Kinston, North Carolina at West Pharmaceutical Services, Corbin, Kentucky at CTA Acoustics, and Huntington, Indiana at Hayes Lemmers, all in 2003. A total of 14 people were killed and 81 injured in these 3 accidents. The CSB is working to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Board members John Breslin and Gary Vischer joined CSB Chairman Carolyn Merritt.
Today the hearing will focus on combustible dust, which the board has come to recognize as a serious industrial safety problem. Dust explosions often cause serious loss of life and terrible economic consequences. While some programs to mitigate dust hazards exist at the state and local level, we recognize there is no comprehensive federal program that addresses this problem.
CSB lead dust study investigator Angela Blair and investigator Jibby Joseph presented preliminary data indicating there have been 197 dust explosion incidents in the United States since 1980, causing 109 fatalities and 592 injuries.
2, 1, fire.
The explosions, which happen when fine particles of dust are ignited, occur in many industries, the CSB found, including rubber and plastic products, chemical manufacturing, primary metal, lumber and wood products, and food products, among others.
Many fatalities and injuries have resulted from combustible dust incidents. Also, various industrial materials pose a combustible dust hazard.
Investigator Blair explained that unlike typical gas or vapor explosions requiring only fuel, oxygen, and ignition, dust explosions also require fine particles to be dispersed in air, and the particles must be confined in a building or other structure.
First, dust settles out on flat surfaces in the plant. These are usually overhead surface, and unfortunately the dust that settles the highest is also the most fine, the smallest particles. Some event, whether it's an explosion of a different sort or turbulent ignition or some other event, disturbs settled dust into a cloud, and that cloud is ignited and explodes. And then the initial explosion, the turbulence and the flame front and the pressure wave generated from the initial explosion loft additional dust, which then explodes. And the explosion continues to propagate throughout the building wherever it can encounter combustible dust that can be lofted into an explosive mixture, and the flame front is still alive to ignite it. So then we have a chain effect of one explosion after another after another.
I think when I look at the statistics, the number of accidents that have happened, it's obvious that a manufacturing facility doesn't want to have an explosion. And these explosions seem to be easily preventable. They're not complicated chemical processes which get out of control. They're really explosions because the dust has accumulated and then there's something that sets it off.
The video footage that I'm about to show you.
Ms. Blair showed the audience video shot by the Lenoir County, North Carolina Fire Department as it fought the West Pharmaceutical dust explosion fire in 2003.
What you are seeing is as close as most of us will ever get to the first-hand experience of being out there on the front lines trying to fight an industrial fire like this. In the foreground is a piece of the building that was propelled several hundred yards.
They were unable to appear in person, but dust explosion victims told their stories in poignant television reports shown to the CSB hearing audience. Workers in these accidents often suffer extensive burns.
Just before I begin, let me say how moved I was by that last presentation and how much I congratulate the board for doing it. We lost 37 members of our union last year. One or another of our staff investigated most of those fatalities on the ground and a lot of other serious injuries. And there's often such a disconnect between going out and meeting with victims and trying to help victims and sort of understand what happened, and then coming to this town and dealing with regulatory agencies that sometimes forget what it's all about. I want to congratulate you for putting that up front. That's very important.
And I think it's important to understand that each of these has a human impact, and that's indeed what we're trying to prevent, is the human impact. The detail and the engineering and the science is interesting, but the outcome is how do we prevent these very tragic and very human impacting, both physically and economically, how do we prevent these events?
The next panel featured testimony on the status and effectiveness of fire codes for preventing dust fires and explosions. It included George Miller of the National Association of State Fire Marshals, Guy Colonna of the National Fire Protection Association, or NFPA, and Dave Conover of the International Code Council. Officials from Kentucky and North Carolina talked about changes they have now made in state regulations in response to CSB accident investigation safety recommendations.
What I would like to say is that based on the CSB investigation, we have made some changes within our local fire code, our state fire code. One of the two changes that were made was to take out some areas of the code that appear to be permissive. We've made that change so that all permits are now mandatory.
We had nowhere to start. We did not have any idea what kind of businesses we had, what kind of problems we had in the state. We got together with the Department of Labor, obtained a list of 7,500 potential dust-producing facilities. We sent a letter to every one of these facilities.
How many?
7,500.
75.
Well, let me clarify something here in a minute. This was the biggest mistake we've made. But we decided, I took it and gave it to my field supervisors and my field people. We've cut this list down to about 2,200 people. That's the people that's on the list right now that we need to inspect. And I think it all boils down to us trying to make them clean up. I think that's the ultimate goal, is just to walk in the plants and have them perfectly clean, and no hidden dust above ceilings and things like that is in some of them. But that's our main problem with it, and that's the type thing we need help with on convincing dust.
So the generation and the information provided by suppliers is really critical.
Yes.
I appreciate this panel. I think it was a very excellent testimony, and I think both Kentucky and North Carolina, the work that you've done following up on the incidents that the CSB's investigated has been very good. I appreciate that.
There may be numerous dust explosions occurring nationwide, but they may not always be brought to the attention of state fire marshals. This, in part, may be the result of a disconnect between state fire marshals' offices and the agencies charged with overseeing combustible dust fires and explosions from a worker safety perspective: the Occupational Safety and Health Administration and the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health.
As noted earlier by the CSB staff, many of the NFPA documents represent the basis for treatment of this subject within various model fire and building codes. NFPA addresses the hazardous chemical area in part based upon the physical nature of the material, that is, solid, liquid, or gas. In other instances, the treatment of a hazardous material may be derived in our codes and standards as a result of its actual use, such as in coal handling operations or chemical laboratories.
A simplistic way to picture the U.S. system is by thinking of a pyramid with national activities at the top and moving down through regional and state activities to local activities at the bottom of the pyramid. Most development is done at the top, adoption throughout the vertical structure of the pyramid, and implementation and enforcement typically at the building site, the local level, at the bottom.
An afternoon panel on voluntary programs to prevent dust explosions featured industry safety experts.
CEPA produces large quantities of organic powders which, when handled, can create combustible dust clouds. Consequently, the design and protection of the manufacturing equipment is essential in order to supply products to our customers in a safe, cost-effective, and timely manner.
Tom Hoppy of CEBA Specialty Chemicals was joined on the panel by Chuck Johnson of the Aluminum Association, David Oberholzer of Valamet, Randy Davis of the industrial explosion group Kidde Fenwal, and Henry Febo of the FM Global Insurance Company.
Primarily, our purpose in the aluminum powder and pigment industry is for the engineering of our processes to be as safe as they can be, with a primary emphasis first on life safety and second on protection of property. And again, the important aspects of dealing with this hazard is a characterization of materials. You have to understand what you're working with. You have to evaluate your process with that in mind.
As we sit here today, there remain thousands of facilities that currently have potentially hazardous processes that have not been adequately protected because they are not aware of the hazard or because budget priorities have not permitted them to take appropriate actions.
FM Global operates on a philosophy that the majority of all property losses are preventable. Prevention requires a client whose management operate from a philosophy that is better to prevent a loss than to recover from one.
In addition to voluntary programs, there was a call from one speaker for widespread adoption of the National Fire Protection Association, or NFPA, codes.
In closing, I would say that the Aluminum Association supports the CSB's current initiative. We do believe, and we have stated previously, that we believe that the NFPA standards should be incorporated at the state and local level for all states. And so when we try to communicate these issues to specific plant locations that are not involved in our association, it's pushing on a rope. We can't get that information out there to everyone, and fire marshals can reach places where we cannot.
Our first speaker has traveled from far away, from Norway, to be here.
The final panel dealt with technical barriers to dust explosion prevention and protection. It featured the noted dust explosion expert, Professor Rolf Eckhoff of Norway's University of Bergen.
As I see it, we are now in the initial phase of a shift in philosophy of dust explosion mitigation. So far, we have been relying on more or less simple rules of thumb. In the years ahead, we shall be seeking more sophisticated methods that provide increased flexibility for tailoring, and hence more cost-effective designs.
Professor Eckhoff was joined on the Technical Barriers panel by Erdem Ural of Loss Prevention Science and Technology Incorporated, John Going of the Fike Corporation, Walt Frank of ABS Consulting, and James Mulligan of Lockheed Martin.
In the U.S., the largest barrier to dust explosion research is the dwindling government and private funding. Most of the published data are coming not from the U.S., but from the rest of the developed world.
While it's important that we continue to develop and refine the technologies required to address combustible dust hazards, technical solutions are of value only when understood and successfully applied.
Modeling results that indicate the location, severity of an explosion could be used in optimizing the design of an industrial process if one is designing from the ground up. Changes in that design could be made that could reduce the effect of an explosion.
Throughout the day, several panelists discussed what they called the inadequacy of material safety data sheets, or MSDSs, in conveying the true hazards of chemical dust.
For example, many MSDSs include numerous pages of toxicological data and environmental fate and transport data. In contrast, they often contain relatively little information about fire, explosion, and reactivity hazards.
We recognize that they're, in many instances, quite inadequate. Matter of fact, some of them in investigations that we've done have been a contributing cause for or root cause for some of these events because they've been so poor.
The public comment period featured a diverse array of opinions on the subject of dust explosion prevention.
I just wanted to make a comment regarding additional regulations. Please don't give us any more regulations. There's plenty out there. I think that if we take the time to maybe fine-tune the existing regulations a little bit, I do agree that perhaps the MSDSs need a little fine-tuning.
And I would argue that individuals who are unaware of the hazards of combustible dust must have been living on the dark side of the moon. And perhaps the easy way to deal with this problem is an educational campaign at first, and people can go look at what's been done.
CCPS recognized several years ago a gap in guidance related to handling dust and particulate solids, and decided to commission the writing of a new book entitled safe handling of powders and bulk solids. Now, this book addresses issues such as tools for process design and plant engineers who are responsible for the designing and running of processes handling particulate solids in the chemical, pharmaceutical, and related manufacturing industries.
It was mentioned that the general duty clause can be used to address the hazard of combustible dust, but really that's a tough tool for a compliance officer to use. I'd like to see the board make some strong recommendations to OSHA to provide a national standard, a vertical standard, either included in the PSM standard, something along those lines, or perhaps along the lines of the grain standard.
Let's get the fuel out of there, and that's, whether you call that housekeeping or not, I'm not sure. I don't think actually housekeeping is quite the right word, because in an environment that releases process dust to its surroundings, the surroundings become part of the process, and it's no longer housekeeping. You have to view the process in a wider scope, and I would urge considering that perspective.
And I heard from one of the panels earlier that even after a facility experienced an explosion, they did their risk analysis and decided it was worth the risk not to solve the problem. And then I hear about voluntary compliance. I'm sorry, that's from my personal perspective and my history, that may not be the best course of action to take. We're talking about what to put on an MSDS sheet. It crossed my mind we may want to create a mushroom cloud to set out beside some of those materials.
Primary explosion from dust is not the reason for the damage and the destruction and the death or injuries. It's the secondary explosion that causes most of the problems. So I want to leave you with the comment that the solution of the secondary explosion may be the better solution than trying to change MSDS or get additional data on MSDS or anything like that.
In closing, Chairman Merritt commended the panelists for their contributions.
I hope you agree this has been a very insightful and stimulating day, and certainly a tremendous value to us at the CSB as we proceed with this study.
The panelists' testimony and public commentary will form part of the official record in the CSB's dust study. To view the complete official record of this public hearing and for ongoing information about the dust explosion and fire study, please visit our website, csb.gov.